This is Lecture 3, Part 2, which I'll be covering recovery and resilience and also commenting on mental health. Now, for the sake of expanding our emergency management vocabulary, I've created a couple of slides to differentiate between recovery and resilience. I suppose it's splitting hairs a bit, but hey, this is graduate school, and so that's part of what we do. Recovery could be considered a subset of resilience. As noted in the independent study course, the IS 1A course, recovery involves the restoration, strengthening, and revitalization of infrastructure, housing, the economy, and other fundamental underpinnings of the community. Resilience, however, is more about capacity and capability to respond and recover to an emergency. It touches on flexibility or adaptability to a crisis. One Department of Homeland Security source defined resilience as, quote, the ability to recover from or adjust to adversity or change, the ability of systems, infrastructures, government, business, and citizenry to absorb and or quickly recover from an adverse event or series of events caused by attack or natural disaster, end quote. So the idea of absorbing and adjusting to crises differs from a strict recovery from the event. So maybe simply in a sense, resilience is somewhat more philosophical, where recovery is more concrete. Lastly, I want to talk about recovery of a different sort, emotional recovery. And not emotional recovery of the community per se, but of our first responders. First responders are trained extensively for what we call the initial attack. They are told the best way to arrive safely at an emergency, what equipment to bring, what equipment to wear, how to effectively handle each of the tools they're assigned, and how to walk step by step through the process of solving the problem. What they are not routinely trained to do is mitigate the long-term effects of seeing, hearing, smelling, and touching things that most people would never experience even once in their life, let alone doing it for 20 or more years of it. The emergency manager may not be a first responder themselves, but the effects that crises take on first responders are a real and present danger to their welfare and by extension to any efforts at mitigating an emergency of any size in the future. In the spirit of maintaining the ongoing mindset of mitigation, the emergency manager must think through what first responders may not consider for themselves. First responders are not what they used to be, and by that I do not mean that they have gotten softer or weaker. I mean that the very group that we consider to be first responders has evolved and are not limited to the traditional disciplines such as police, fire, and EMS. It now includes non-traditional responders such as construction workers that have to clear away debris, sometimes with the remains of bodies amidst the rubble, and public health workers that are exposed to grotesque and extreme hazards. For the same reasons, it includes search and rescue personnel and healthcare providers. These groups are exposed to some of the same prolonged and intense exposure to death, injury, and destruction on a wide scale. Those exposed to these conditions may manifest effects in different ways. There's mild transient distress, which involves sleep loss, maybe increased fear, anxiety, anger, and sadness. There are moderate symptoms that may include prolonged insomnia and long-term changes in personal behavior. And then the most serious is actual psychological illness, and that's where we get to PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and then prolonged or major depression requiring professional treatment. While there are three basic levels of severity of the effects for responding to traumatic events, it does not necessarily take place in a linear or incremental way. There are too many variables at play, and I certainly am not a mental health professional. However, in the assigned reading this week, there is a graphic that illustrates the interconnectedness of some of these behaviors and symptoms. You can see how these consequences bear themselves out in very different ways, from excessive fear to over-dedication. Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, a behavioral scientist for law enforcement, refers to that latter phenomenon as an overinvestment in the job. While extraordinary events such as 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, the Joplin, Missouri tornadoes, and others serve as a clear impetus for some mental health issues, the quote-unquote everyday crises of emergency responders can contribute to many of the same effects. Clark and Tracy Paris, a couple that offers mental health training to law enforcement, have a presentation that's called Winning the Battle. The two refer to the process of dealing with everyday issues as cop stew. What is routine to first responders would be horrific to most people. The fact that first responders are exposed to them routinely does not eliminate their impact on that responder. First responders have different sized pots, but each time they experience these unique and disturbing events, they add a little bit more to their pot. Eventually, that pot may boil over unexpectedly, resulting in some of the behaviors noted on the previous slide. Predictors of future problems are tied to three factors: proximity, duration, and intensity. Or, another way to think of it is how close they are to the crisis itself, how long they are exposed to that crisis, and to what degree they must be involved with it. If emergency managers are familiar with these factors are in a position to advise decision makers as the response unfolds, they may be able to save the lives and families of these responders after it ends. Finding ways to limit these factors for individuals may be one of the most important things an emergency manager does in their career. And methods of mitigation include the characteristics of the disaster and the responder. The emergency manager has no real control over each of these. A second factor is the responder's past training and experience in dealing with a significant crisis. Again, the emergency manager has very little control of much of this too. But lastly is the post-event support, and here the emergency manager can fill an important gap. Identifying resources before the emergency hits and facilitating their use afterward is a proven winner. Here is mitigation again. Finding ways to diminish the negative consequences of disasters with our most important resource, our people.